May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be aligned with your love, O God, our strength, our courage, our freedom, and our community. Amen. So the lessons appointed for our reading and for our rumination and our savoring for quite a while have had the word wisdom in it. And we are called and invited to go deeper in our understanding of what actually is wisdom. Oftentimes, wisdom is translated from the word Sophia, which indicates that there is some feminine God in wisdom. And also, the English word wisdom is translated from a word meaning to see, from the Vedas, interestingly enough. Please, please, please let me tell this story without your thinking that I'm name dropping. I'm talking about somebody who is a friend and a mentor who was. His name was Desmond Tutu. He was the Archbishop of South Africa and great diocese. And he was a personal friend of ours where I worked in Los Angeles. And his daughter Naomi wrote a little thin volume, a collection of his sermons. And in the introduction to these sermons, she tells the story of her sister and her and going with their mother, following Archbishop Desmond Tutu around everywhere he preached. And she says in the introduction that within 30 seconds of his beginning the sermon, they would turn to one another and say, "Sermon number 4." They said he only preached about 4 or 5 sermons and just repeated them. And then he writes, "She's wrong. I only have 1 sermon. And the sermon I have," he said, "is community." He's the person who taught me that you cannot be a Christian alone. You also, he rushed to add, cannot be a human being alone. And he would say, you cannot be a wise person alone. His favorite word for community was a Zulu word, Ubuntu, which means I am because we are. A person needs other persons to be a person. Community, wisdom, humanity is radically relational. If it's not relational, it ain't true. It doesn't help. It's not of God. That is in a resonant way the same thing that's said in all of the readings appointed for today. I need other people to be a person, as do you, as does everyone. I love the string of things. Wish we had time to read them all, but the string of virtues that are listed in James 3. Who is wise and understanding among you? One translation says, it's the way you live, not the way you talk that counts. Another translation says, it certainly isn't bitter envies and selfishness and mean-spirited ambition out to get your own way, in another translation. It's wisdom that comes from above. It's wisdom that comes from God. It is first pure. Another translation says, it has no hidden agendas and is not manipulative. Have you ever known somebody who had a conversation with you and they really had a hidden agenda? or where they were trying to control you or trying to get you to do something. Oh, I've done that myself so many times. But real wisdom, according to the Message translation, is God's wisdom. And it's characterized by getting along with others. You can develop a healthy, robust sense of community if you treat each other with dignity and honor. Everyone. So, if you really want this wisdom to live inside you, the indigenous translation reads, "Draw near to the Great Spirit, and the Great Spirit will draw near to you." A memory verse from my childhood as a Baptist says in Proverbs, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not upon your own understanding, and God will direct your paths." Every day of my life, particularly in my centering prayer practice, there comes a moment where I feel like the Great Spirit says, "Ed, quit leaning on your own understanding. Give it up. Let it go. And let the Great Spirit direct your path." Jesus tells the same story. In Mark, he and his disciples are going to Capernaum, and they had been talking amongst themselves, and he could pick up that something was wrong. What were they bickering about, talking about, snipping about, gossiping about? And he asks them, and they came clean and said, "Jesus, we were arguing with one another about who is the greatest or who's the most important." And Jesus says, if you're really interested in leadership, it's important for you to be the last of all and the servant of all. I'll never forget Desmond Tutu being in the pulpit where we were, and he was saying, when God and Jesus talk about all, they're serious. A-L-L. What about all do you not get? It's honoring all equally, including all that is in creation: leaves, lizards, rocks, the Tennessee River. All. That's the blue light special in today's lessons. If you want to be a leader, if you want to be a wise person, if you want to be one of the magi in life, commit yourself to being a servant of all, of community, of radical inclusion. Wisdom is about becoming the servant of and to community, understood as a verb. When you're a servant of community, or the whole, or Richard Rohr's naming us objective unity with God and all creation. We're not damaged, we're not fallen, we're not evil. We are objectively at one with God and all creation. And in that wisdom, there is no greatest, because everyone is the greatest and the indispensable. My life was changed in 2014 when an experience took me deeper into this experience. I read an essay by the philosopher and theologian John Cobb, who's about to turn 100, lives in Claremont, California. He had read about the largest and oldest organism on the planet called Pando, which means I spread. In the late 60s, some botanists and arborists had a hypothesis that this 106-acre root ball of 57,000 tall quaking aspens in southern Utah was one plant, one organism. And all these things that looked like separate trees actually were separate stems of the same plant, of the same organism. I had to find out about this. And so I got with John and I got with some other people who were friends of his, and we took 2 pilgrimages to southern Utah to experience Pando, a one-tree forest, a grove, all the same, one community, A-L-L, all. And I committed myself in a deeper way to allness, to wholeness, to community. Cynthia Bourgeault, soon after that, maybe before, said, everything that we're learning from physicists and botanists and all the scientists, verifying that Albert Einstein was telling the truth when he said that the universe is one universe, that we can understand Jesus more deeply in saying not that the royal rule, as we heard last week or the week before from St. Paul, love your neighbor as yourself. That's not a situation that conventional theology has described it as, where you build up a bunch of love inside yourself and it's so big that you love everybody else with that kind of love, and with that love. No, actually, loving your neighbor as yourself is finding out that your neighbor is yourself. So when you see somebody on the street who doesn't have a home, who hasn't had a shower, who doesn't have a place to lay their head, when you see someone on the political scene who's acting in an inhumane way, when you see wars going on and 41,000 people killed in Gaza and Jewish hostages still being held, it's okay, it's important to have some evaluation of that and try to hold accountable some people and to bring justice and nonviolence. And it's important for you to understand that they are you. A friend of mine who's in a book group sent me a poem this week. She had been at a presentation of a Monsignor I'd never heard about, Arturo Banuelos. And he made his entire speech based on this indigenous saying in Mexico, tú eres mi otro yo. He said our indigenous ancestors in their wisdom teach us tú eres mi otro yo, which means you are my other self. We are all intimately interrelated, he went on to write, interdependent and essentially a sacred part of each other. tu eres mio troyo binds us so closely together so that if I hurt you, I hurt myself. And if I am part of your light shining, mine shines all the brighter. We've printed that poem and a lot of the speech in today's service bulletin. Whenever I do that, I secretly want to control y'all, and I'm backing up from that. But let me invite you to take that home and put it in the novel you're reading so that you can be reminded that you've been invited into and baptized into being a servant in the service of all. Finally, my dear friend Dan Siegel, who's professor of neuroscience and psychiatry at UCLA, has written many books on mind sight. And his latest book is called Intraconnected. He said it's just not enough to say we're interconnected, because we're all of the same corn cob. We're all the same ear of corn. We're all the same cluster of grapes. We're all in the same pod of peas. In college, we had intramural sports and intramural sports. And the intramural sports meant that the teams that were playing against one another were all from the same organization. Intramurals. I think I'm invited to invite you, whenever you're tempted, to think of yourself as not a part of the same organization, the organization of God's creation. That you think maybe that message is coming to you from something other than God. And the real divine message coming to us today is that we're in the same organization, the same creation, with one another, the people who see politics differently, the people who live on the streets, and every leaf, lizard, and rock. Amen.